The Nintendo 64 was an odd machine for its time. Instead of joining the rest of the world with discs, Nintendo remained true to their cartridge roots in favor of quicker load times and battery saves. While this may have been for better or worse, the 64 had some stellar games that have shaped the industry into what it is today, such as GoldenEye and Mario 64. One of the strangest features the 64 had, however, was its controller, and while today it's nearly iconic, when this thing first debuted, the world did a near unanimous So when you see one of these in the wild, you can safely assume that there's a Nintendo 64 somewhere close by, right? Right? Well, no. Actually, not at all. This is the Super Joy 3, a knockoff that instead has a cartridge built into the controller that boasts 12,000 games in one. And that's an awful lot considering there are about only 800 known games in the NES library. I want to clarify something. This is actually my second Super Joy, and it's slightly different from the first one I had. For starters, the one I had came with a cartridge port, and a cart that had all the games in it. The cart protruded out of the back, right here, where these grooves are, and it made it so you really couldn't hold the thing properly. From what I understand, it was actually a universal NES and could play any game from here to Japan, but I never got to try that because it caught fire. Yes, these things are kinda dangerous, so fair warning. And, you know, that's why I bought a second one for $4 at a thrift shop, because buying one of these secondhand is definitely a safer idea. When you look at the Super Joy 3, you'll notice that there are two sets of A and B buttons, the bottom of which is just regular, while the top set are actually turbo buttons. These buttons are spaced so awkwardly that there doesn't really feel like there's any proper way to hold it, and the turbo buttons are absolutely useless. I can't think of a game on here that requires you to tap A frequently enough to really use it. You've then got the start and select buttons over here, which are pretty self-explanatory. I mean, they work. That's good. Then you have the reset button, which is oddly enough right over the start button for the real 64 controller, so it can be a little bit misleading. The D-pad is a joke. It barely feels like it's connected, and you have to jam your thumb down as hard as you can to go in any direction. One would think that you could just use the analog stick, but mine's broken off. And, well, that doesn't really make a bit of difference because the analog stick is completely for show. I'm not joking here. These Super Joys have a plastic analog stick that doesn't move or do anything at all. It's just there to further convince you that it's a 64 controller, which, by the way, it isn't. On the top you've got the on and off switch, an input for the power supply, two AV outlets, and another port for a second controller. But we'll get to the second controller later. For now, let's play some games. Oh, 12,000 games in one. Now that's impressive. Well, why don't we start off with some good old Super Mario? Guess Luigi couldn't make it, so they had to drop the bros off. Now, from what I can tell, and Super Mario Bros. Is the only game that seems to do this, when you start it, something's kind of off. The music is really fast for some reason, and I think the gameplay's slightly faster too. The D-pad, along with the buttons, show off how terrible they are here with Super Mario Bros., a game that requires quick reaction and tight controls, which this thing simply does not deliver. Moving on, we've got Paperboy, and I love this game on the Genesis, but I honestly couldn't care less about any other version, so I bet this is going to be a blast to play on the Super Joy. No, it's not. Again, everything about this setup is awkward, and it feels like it's delayed with Paperboy, so that just adds to the frustration. Well, let's go backwards here so we can see titles such as Crush Cage and Galaga T. Who doesn't remember Galaga T? Here's where the whole sham of 12,001 comes into play, because if you hadn't guessed, there really aren't 12,000 games on this thing. There's maybe 30 or so actually on here. The list just repeats itself several times over, with these modifications to each game, some of which don't really seem to do anything at all. For instance, here's Mario Fly. You choose it, and nothing's different. At least, nothing that I can immediately tell. A lot of these games tend to just start you at a different level from the start, and I've yet to find one that really changes much else. The one game that the programmers seemed to fall back on was Paperboy, since a lot of these titles just fire that up, with no changes at all. The names they chose for this is really odd too, like Thief Golden and Policeman and Thief, just to name a few. The audio and visual on the Super Joy is pretty terrible as well, with these huge scan lines running down the screen. The ones you see here aren't from my recording. The game looks like that all the time. While it's okay in certain games, there are several instances that the sound just seems weird. Like I said earlier about Mario, only not quite to that extent. There's some really good games on here, and I don't need to waste your time telling you how great Contra or Pac-Man is, but they're completely bogged down by the awkward control setup this thing has. Not to mention the fact that there is a delay in certain games, and it almost starts to hurt your hands after playing for a while. It's just not worth the frustration. One last thing. If you should ever want to stop being friends with somebody, the Super Joy 3 also has a second controller port for both the gun and extra controller. This is the gun, although this is all I can really show you since it doesn't seem to work. This gun actually came with my first Super Joy, the one that, caught fire, so maybe they aren't compatible or it's gotten broken over the years. I'm not really sure, but knowing the Super Joy, it doesn't really surprise me. If you thought the controller for the first player was bad, well, behold. This is what the second player has to deal with. Just look at this thing. It's an even worse knockoff of a Genesis controller. All of the buttons are on this weird groove. You've got two C buttons that don't do anything, and the D-pad is just as bad, if not worse, than the one on the Super Joy itself. What else is there to say? I mean, well, it works. As in you can plug it in, play a game for about 5 minutes, and I use the word play very loosely, and then watch your friend leave and never talk to you again. The Super Joy is an oddity in and of itself. It feels so lazy, yet the idea behind it is one that I can see that would easily appeal to someone who maybe hasn't played video games since the 80s or just wants a whole bunch of Nintendo games in one. My advice though, you're probably better off just tracking down the old Nintendo games. Even if you can get all this for $4 like I did. At least your cartridges don't risk burning down your house.